Title Sports Central will be going over next. Final prediction of this offseason, and it will be over Vanderbilt. And this is a team that went 3-9 in 2019. And overall, Vanderbilt's been a team that really has not had a whole lot of success over the past few years. So today we're going to be going over whether or not they can get over that hump and get to a bowl game in 2020, along with a full preview. We'll be going over your returning production, along with a full prediction on every game for Vanderbilt's schedule. So with that, let's look at your season trends from 2019 for this team. Of course, once again, they were 3-9 overall. They were 2-5 between September and October. Then they were 1-4 between November and the postseason. So this is overall kind of an inconsistent team last season. I mean, they had a couple of decent wins in October, of course, but I mean, in the end, Vanderbilt still was a 3-9 team. Your key wins, of course, they had only 3 wins, but your 2 best ones I would consider to be your Missouri win, 21-14. So that was good that they're at least able to get a conference win. But they were also able to get a win against East Tennessee State, 38-0, and that was actually a shutout, which, in my opinion, I mean, it takes skill to shut out any team. So overall, that was a good win there for Vanderbilt as well. As far as your returning production goes, you lose your starting quarterback Riley Neal, which he was a big part of this team last season. I mean, he was a decent quarterback. He was nothing special or anything, but he did put up some good stats. He had just right around 1,600 yards with 9 touchdowns and 5 interceptions last season. And as far as the running back situation goes, they lose their top running back Keyshawn Vaughn, which had just right around 1,300 yards with 10 touchdowns last season. So he was actually a really good running back, one of the best I'd consider to be in Vanderbilt's division, and possibly even in the SEC. I mean, you got to consider how well Vanderbilt was last season. They did not have a whole lot of talent on that offense, and especially that offensive line. And for Keyshawn Vaughn to put up 1,300 yards for this team last season, considering how bad of an offensive line they had, that does take a lot of skill. So definitely, I mean, he was a great running back last season. They returned their second running back, Keon Brooks, which he was a decent player last season. Of course, he didn't have a whole lot of action, but it looks like he will be their top running back next season. They do lose their top receiver, Khalil Lipscomb, which he had just right around 600 yards with 3 touchdowns last season. So, I mean, he was a pretty good receiver overall, and so that's going to be a tough loss there. Not as bad as Keyshawn Vaughn, though. That certainly is going to be a pretty tough loss for this team going into 2020. For the most part, though, they do return all of their other wide receivers, and that includes Cam Johnson and Chris Pierce, which both of those receivers combined for just right around 550 yards last season, with Cam Johnson having just over 300 yards. So, I mean, those are a couple of good wide receivers. They definitely do need to pick up the action a little bit if Vanderbilt's going to be a team that makes it to a bowl game next season. But, I mean, you also have a different loss in your tight end, Jared Pinkney. Of course, he had 233 yards last season with a couple of touchdowns too. So, and I mean, he was actually fourth for rushing on the, or for receiving. Sorry, is what I should say. And I mean, he was a decent tight end, of course. Nothing like crazy. Nothing like, he wasn't the best one in the SEC by far, but he still did put up a decent amount of yardage, considering this isn't a very big receiving team. As far as the offensive line goes, you lose 1 on the offensive line. You also lose 1 on the defensive line. So overall, this offensive line's looking pretty good, but the defense definitely has a ton of room to improve. I mean, pretty much on the defense, the only thing that you lose is your defensive linemen, and I mean, you return basically your entire linebacking core and your secondary. So Vanderbilt's looking really good, I think, for the defense in 2020. And of course, we know, I mean, they did not have a very good defense at all in 2019, and so, yeah, considering, I mean, how they weren't very good last year, it is good that they return basically their entire defense for another season. That should certainly improve. It's just a matter of how much it will. Chances of making a bowl game in 2020 for Vanderbilt, of course, I mean, typically we'll see a big surprise team or two out of the FBS each season, and I don't think Vanderbilt's going to be one of those teams. I don't think Vanderbilt does anything crazy in 2020. I mean, it's going to be tough to say whether or not they can make it to a bowl game. Once again, when you're losing your starting quarterback, Riley Neal, along with a really good running back in Keyshawn Vaughn, it just really concerns me for Vanderbilt, and I think it's going to be close. I certainly think that they'll have a good chance to put up some damage in the SEC, possibly make a run for it, but I don't think I'm very confident that they will make it to a bowl game in 2020. Once again, I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I just don't think that it is very likely that they'll be able to get up to that level yet. As far as your schedule goes, you start off the season against Mercer on the 5th, and that's going to be a home game. Then you got a road trip to Missouri on the 12th, followed by a road trip to Kansas State on the 19th. So your first 3 weeks are actually going to be really tough. I mean, for most FBS teams, for most Power 5 conference teams, I mean, you have the benefit of having most of your first games at home, and for Vanderbilt, they've got 2 of their first 3 on the road, which that does concern me quite a little bit, especially for Vanderbilt being a team that usually is not all that great that could be pretty detrimental to them. On the 26th, they play Colorado State. Then you got a road trip to Georgia, which that's going to be a tough game there. Then you got Ole Miss at home, followed by Kentucky on the road. Then you got South Carolina at home as well. And then in November, you got Florida, Texas A&M, Louisiana Tech, and Tennessee. So that November is looking really tough as well. So, the bad thing is for Vanderbilt, you guys have a very, very difficult schedule. I mean, one of your non-conference games is going to be a tough one against Kansas State. And then, of course, your SEC schedule is looking pretty tough too, having to play Georgia on the road, then Florida at home, along with Texas A&M and Tennessee, two teams I do expect to make a big run for 9 wins next season, especially in Texas A&M. You got a big road game in Kyle Field on November 14th. So for Vanderbilt, here's what I'm expecting out of your September. I think you go 2-2 between your September. I think Missouri and Kansas State, both of those will be losses mainly because they're early on in the season and they're both road games. But overall, Mercer and Colorado State, I definitely think are both very winnable games, especially that Mercer one. I think Vanderbilt knocks out Mercer in that game. And then Colorado State, that'll be a bit of a closer one, but I do think you get a win there against Colorado State. As far as your October looks, I think you lose all 4 games in October. I'm sure this is something that most Vanderbilt fans would not like to hear. But this is just a really tough October. You have to start off the month with a road trip to Georgia, which Georgia next season I expect to be a top 15 team basically the entire season. It wouldn't surprise me to see them be a top 10 team for the whole season. So yeah, for Georgia, that's going to be a tough game, especially on October 3rd. Then you get an Ole Miss game at home, which is honestly winnable. I think Vanderbilt definitely hangs around in that game, but I think Ole Miss gets the win in the end. That Kentucky game on the road is going to be tough too. And then you got South Carolina, of course, at home. Another game that is very winnable, but I just don't think it goes Vanderbilt's way. And yeah, with that, as far as your November goes, I think you get a win in November against Louisiana Tech. But I just think you really struggle this season to get out an SEC win. I think Florida's going to be a really tough one. Then Texas A&M on the road. Those 2 games especially are going to be really tough. Then that Louisiana Tech game is very winnable, I think. I think Vanderbilt gets the win there in the end. You can't forget that Louisiana Tech made it to a bowl game last season. So yeah, you can't forget about that. But I do think Vanderbilt has enough potential and enough talent to be able to pull off a win there. And I think that Tennessee game too is going to be really tough. Once again, Tennessee last season, they improved a ton. If you look at their schedule, that was one of the worst teams in the Power 5 at the start of the season. Then once they kind of progressed, towards the end of their schedule, towards the end of the season, Tennessee really ramped it up, and they were looking very good. So I think that that Tennessee game is going to be really tough, and especially at home. And I think Vanderbilt could have potential to possibly hang around to that one with it being at home and also in a rivalry game. Who knows? Vanderbilt could pull off a big upset, but I do expect Tennessee to get a win in the end. And so that brings up your record prediction to 3-9. And I'm sure most Vanderbilt fans don't really like to see it, but at this point, Vanderbilt's just a team that really has struggled a lot over the past few years. They do have potential this season, no doubt. But the thing is that when you lose your top quarterback and your running back Keyshawn Vaughn, who put up 1,300 yards last season, and you pretty much no other key player returning, it does concern me quite a bit for Vanderbilt, and that's the reason why I do expect them to kind of decline a bit in 2020. So yeah, with that about wraps up our final prediction on Vanderbilt. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on this team, and if you enjoyed this preview, be sure to slap a like on it, subscribe as well. Really helps out the channel, and I appreciate that a ton. But yeah, as always, thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I will see you all later.